How are you?
Good, but I'm not the one that's facing surgery soon.
Oh, well, I'm not the only one.
Don't go there, right?
Right, exactly. So we have Brookdale on, it seems.
Oh, there's
Brookdale is with us.
Good. Good morning, Brookdale.
Good morning.
And Egg Harbor. So it looks like all we're waiting for is Radnor, Helen, is that right?
I think so.
Okay, great.
Is that Harbor signs on? Oh, I see them down there in the corner.
Yeah, that's them, I think.
Should I put that closer?
It's designed to pick you up.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
You don't have to leave them, so don't feel.
No, fine.
So, Jennifer, while we're sitting here doing nothing, explain to me, like right now on my TV screen, I see me twice. I see you, I see Eva, I see Egg Harbor Township, but they're really little. Are
Yeah.
you seeing the same thing that I'm seeing? Exactly the same way? Or
I'm not
who's
seeing
controlling what we're seeing on the screen?
Well, to some degree, Magpie is, so I can change the layout, and that's what we have been doing during the other programs. You know, when everybody's checking in, we just leave it so that it's called one big and several little pictures. So you have, like right now, Brookdale is in a large window on my screen, and everybody else is in the small windows. But when Brookdale unmutes, or when another school would unmute, they would go in the large window. But I can change that, and when Brookdale starts to speak, I'll put them in the big window, so they'll be full screen.
Oh,
The reason
good.
why I think,
Okay.
the reason why I think you're seeing yourself, Helen, is because
Right.
I would imagine you have your picture-in-picture enabled. So Michael or someone there has your PIP enabled, so you're seeing your own video, but you can disable that, so you don't have to see yourself twice.
Oh, that would be good, because I'm the last person out of this group that we need to see twice.
Well, I was going to say, for some of us, it's hard enough to see yourself once, let alone twice.
That's exactly it. You got it.
Yeah, but I'll go ahead and show you how we can change the configuration.
Wait. Before you do that, can you explain to Michael how to disable the picture-in-picture?
Oh, sure. It should be right on your remote, Michael. Let's see, what are you using? I can't remember. Polycom?
Yes, I have the Polycom.
Yeah, there should be a button that take picture-in-picture off on your remote, but I can't remember what you're using. Is it an HDX?
Let's see. It actually doesn't say on the remote.
Let's see.
I can give you a glimpse if that helps at all.
Oh, she's got the same book.
What if you push this directory
So I
button?
think it's actually in, you might have to go and check the system settings. Like in mine, if you go, use your back button, and then go to the system menu.
Okay, let's give that a try.
Hey,
Okay,
Jennifer.
we have...
Good morning,
System
Catherine.
menu.
How are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Doing well, thanks. Great to see
Our
you.
class is coming in momentarily. I was going to put it on mute. Okay?
That sounds good.
Jennifer?
Yes, Michael.
I have, I'm in the system menu. I have admin settings, diagnostics, system information, and utility.
Yeah, now I have to figure out where this would be in the. John, are you listening by any chance? John is Magpie.
No such luck.
Well.
Okay, so I'll just pretend I don't see myself. It's all right.
I'm looking. Let's see. Hold on a second, Michael.
Okay.
Really shouldn't. Hey, you know what? What happens when you put, oh, you are listening.
No, Michael is.
Oh, good. Sterling needs to get their PIP off. Do you remember where that is? John's here. We did have the omnipotent magpie technical person listening, so we did get support.
Always a good thing, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, indeed.
Hi, John.
Hi.
I think that was a delayed reaction.
I'm getting ready for eye surgery, so I have a very difficult time seeing at the moment.
Oh,
So concentrating
okay.
on trying to see the remote versus hearing, it's been challenging.
Oh.
So sorry to
That's
cause you
okay.
all these problems.
Shouldn't be this hard.
Should be the display button.
Okay. Well, let's play with that.
Or is there something in there that says picture-in-picture?
I
No.
thought that's where it was.
Nah. I think it's the display button. But I'm going to have to double check on it.
Jennifer, it sounds like your team is falling apart at the seams over there.
I was going to say something, Helen. We're just falling apart, right? There's multiple surgeries.
One is going,
scheduled.
one is going for eye surgery, one is going for back surgery. What are we going to do with you?
I know. Yeah, we power on, right? Michael, I'm not exactly sure where to tell you to go to turn that off, to be honest with you. And John was just in here, but did you try? Let's see. The display. That's not.
I've
doing
tried
it, right?
display. It looks like that just toggles back and forth between seeing ourselves and seeing all of you.
Okay. Give me 1 second.
Certainly.
There's always an opportunity to read the manual. All right.
You
so
walk
it says-
around with a manual?
I just Googled it.
Oh, God.
That's incredible.
Okay, Michael, go back to that. We have 3 minutes, so we can walk through this. Go back to that system menu, please, if you will. Are you in there?
A wonderful facial expression.
Yeah. Michael, did we lose you? Oh, just when I was getting to the good part where we actually could make this work. They may have rebooted their system, folks, so. And welcome, students. I see we have Radnor and Egg Harbor, so both classes look ready to go. Are you guys awake and ready for this program this morning? Wonderful. And I know that you're all pros at Magpie programs, but I will just quickly mention as we're waiting for Michael to get reconnected that as with any of our multi-point video conferences, we would greatly appreciate it if you keep your microphones muted if you're not speaking. That way, if there are any announcements that come through your loudspeakers or any room noises, we won't be interrupted in the middle of the program. So please remember to keep your microphones muted if you're not talking. And other than that, we'll be ready to go in just 2 minutes unless anybody has any questions before we get started.
How do we get that other school visible? The school.
They're working on
That's what they're working on?
generating. She was going to begin now. So I'm going to leave that.
Oh,
I
okay.
want you to know that what they're seeing
Mhm.
inside is nothing new.
Okay.
Picture her and all of the individual schools. The shot of you is the same. You're the star here and there.
Okay.
Jennifer, can you hear us?
Yes, we can. Welcome back.
Thank you. We lost you for a little while, so we decided we're not going to play with Google and we're not going to change any pictures.
Okay,
We're
great.
just going to stay the way we are and get started. Because
Okay, Helen,
is
sounds good.
Radnor, are the kids at Radnor and Egg Harbor Township in the classrooms?
Yes, they are.
Wait.
Okay, then I think we'd like to get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Helen Kirschbaum. I'm the Education Director at the Goodwin Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And we're happy to be joining you this morning. Eva Wiener is a Holocaust survivor who's going to be speaking to you today. And we'd like to start by thanking both Sterling High School and Brookdale Community College for their help this morning, because Eva's coming to us from Brookdale. I'm at Sterling, and we're proud to be partnering with MAGPIE as well as the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education, and MAGPIE will be recording today's program. So before we get started, I'd like to ask both of the schools to introduce yourselves and tell us where you're located. So Egg Harbor Township, would you like to start us off?
Absolutely. Egg Harbor Township is a lovely community around 10 kilometers northwest of Atlantic City, and we're having a little bit of trouble. We had to come back into the call, so if we drop, we'll come back in, but we're unmuting the mic, and then Mike is gonna, we'll be here, but we may not be able to say anything until he gets back with a new remote. So we're really happy to be with you guys.
Thanks, Steve. We could hear you clearly, so I'm not sure what your issue is there. I'm hoping you can hear us.
We can hear you. It's like Verizon. It's perfect.
All right. Well, we hope you're with us for the whole program. Radnor Middle School, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us where you're located?
Hi, everybody. We're Radnor Middle School. We're in Wayne, Pennsylvania. We're just a few miles west of Philadelphia, if that gives you a little bit more of detail. We're in 8th grade language arts class. Really excited to be here today.
Well, thank you. We're happy to have you with us. Mrs. Wiener, now that you know who's listening to you, I'd like you to take this opportunity and share a little bit of your story and your experience during the Holocaust with the students. We know that, every survivor has a very unique experience, and everyone's life, no matter how they survived, was changed dramatically because of the hatred and the prejudice that was allowed to go on during this period in history. But your story is certainly unique. So can you share that with us this morning? And then when you're finished, we'll open it up to questions from the students.
Thank you, Helen. Good morning, everybody. For many years, I never even considered myself a survivor because I did not have the background that so many survivors have of being in a concentration camp or a hidden child or many of the other stories that you might possibly have already heard from survivors. But many years later, I decided that maybe I had a story to tell that was connected to the Holocaust and in a way was a survivor of a different kind. My family, both after leaving Poland, both my mother and father and their siblings left because of pogroms during the First World War, traveled through Europe and ended up in Berlin, Germany, where they met and were married, and that's where I was born. By the time my parents were married, a man by the name of Adolf Hitler had already risen to power, and life for Jews in Germany was very, very difficult. My father was one of 8 children, and they owned a bakery. All the children worked in the bakery. But because of the Nuremberg laws, which were passed to inhibit the actions of all Jews. My parents were not allowed to sell to anyone other than Jews. Jewish doctors were not allowed to treat anyone other than other Jewish people. And children were no longer allowed to go to public school. Life became very, very difficult. And people tried desperately to leave Germany. My family saw some of the problems. My father's sisters and brothers decided to leave Germany and go to a place called Palestine, now known as Israel. But then a very, very calamity night happened, and that was the night of broken glass known as Kristallnacht. It was a turning point in the history of Europe. The next day, my father and many other men were put on a train and sent back to what they called the country of origin. And since my father was born in Poland, they sent him back to the capital of Poland, which was Warsaw. Now my mother was left with me, and I was just a baby, and her two sisters also desperately trying to find ways of leaving the country. They started standing on embassy lines and consulate lines, desperately asking any country that would possibly issue them papers to be able to enter another country and leave Germany. My mother was able to get a wonderful visa, which is not like MasterCard, but a visa which allows you to enter your country. She was able to get a visa to Siam and was absolutely thrilled to have found a way of getting out of the country. She had been told that if she could prove that she had papers to leave the country, that was possible for my father to come back from Germany to join her on the condition they left immediately. In the meantime, however, my mother's brother had gone to Cuba. So she sent my uncle money to buy landing permits for Cuba. While my father was able to travel back from Poland to join her in Berlin, rather than go to Siam, which was a very undeveloped country, the papers came for Cuba. So my mother and father were delighted to be able to go to an island which was 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Because, of course, the ultimate goal was to come to America. And we figured we would stay in Cuba until our immigration number became effective, and then we were able to enter the United States. So given a choice of going to Cuba or to Siam, there was no choice, really. They decided to go to Cuba. My mother was able to book passage on a ship known as the St. Louis, which was owned by a Holland America line. My parents packed what few belongings they were allowed to take with them. We got on a train, went from Berlin to Hamburg, Germany, which was where the dock was, and that's where the ship was anchored. We got to Hamburg, to the dock, and what a surprise. Here is this magnificent cruise ship. And there were banners, and there was a band on the dock, and they were playing, and a photographer taking pictures of all the passengers as they were getting on the ship. And the passengers were delighted because here they were, able now to leave the persecution of Germany and leave for freedom on this beautiful cruise ship that was going to Havana, Cuba. The trip over was delightful. There were birth parties and dances and movies, and it was a typical cruise ship, even had a very nice little pool on the deck, and everybody was having a good time. We got all the way across the Atlantic, came into Havana Harbor, but all of a sudden they were not allowing the ship to come up to the dock. But nobody knew why. Even the captain was not aware of all that was going on behind the scenes. The German government had infiltrated the Cuban government by placing their delegates in the government. And they literally told the president of Cuba not to allow the ship to dock. And the Cuban president, President Brew, was not a very nice man, anyway, very corrupt, and had not received any payoffs, and was a little angry about that. So he decided to do what his advisors had told him, and he refused to allow the ship to dock. The captain was very dismayed. He was very upset because he did not want to take his passengers back to Germany because he knew that their fate was not going to be a good one if they were sent back to Germany. He couldn't understand what was going on. He decided to form a passenger committee. He took from the passenger list a group of people who were very prominent and educated. You have to understand, too, that none of the passengers of the St. Louis were poor or destitute. We all paid a lot of money for our passage and our visas and our papers. Many of our passengers were professionals, doctors and lawyers, and my father owned 3 businesses. It was not as if he were a ward to the state. So the captain chose very select people to try to be negotiators, to try to talk to the Cuban government and other governments around the world, trying to find a solution to the problem. There were negotiations back and forth, but no one was giving in. President Brew allowed only a handful of passengers to get off the ship, and they were a very select group of people. The rest of the passengers had to go back to Europe. The captain was so desperate that he actually went to Miami, which was only 90 miles away from Havana. And the ship went close to the Miami shores, but the United States Coast Guard came out and sent us away. They were afraid people might jump overboard and try to swim ashore. So the ship was sent back to Havana. Negotiations were going on all over. They were contacting every country of the world, trying to find a safe haven. Finally, the captain had no choice, but he had to turn the ship around and go back to Europe. While we were traveling back to Europe, 4 countries agreed to take part of the passenger list. We were 900 passengers, and no one country said, okay, we'll take them all. Belgium, Holland, France, and England all agreed to take approximately 250 people. My father requested that we go to England, and he was very, very, very grateful that the group that made the decisions agreed to let us go to England. he felt that the English Channel that broke between England and Europe might protect us from what was going on in Europe at the time. It was a very wise move on his part, because we, my parents and I, were fortunate enough to be able to have gotten off in England. Only weeks after the ship landed in Europe, the Germans overran Europe, and only 10% of the passengers that went to the other 3 countries actually survived the war. And we in England, because England fought on the side of the Allies, on the American side, we were much safer. We were able to get to England, and with great difficulty, my father finally found work. He was lucky that his family had owned a bakery in Berlin, and he was a trained baker. Therefore, he was able to find work as a baker in England, so we were able to eat. We were bombed out many times, as London was bombed by Germany. We had a difficult life in England, but I cannot possibly compare the life I had in England with the difficulties of those that stayed or went to the other 3 countries. In 1946, after the war, my parents were able to book passage on another ship. This time, we came to the United States because my mother's family had already been able to come to the United States several years before. Unfortunately, the day we arrived in New York City, there was a dock strike. Very, very scary, because they didn't let us get off the ship. We were certainly afraid that we might be sent back to Europe. And we saw the frights that we had in Cuba, reliving it in the harbor of New York. But fortunately, the dock strike was ended soon after, and we were able to get off the ship. And we settled in New York City. Very grateful to have been able to come to the United States. Unfortunately, we could not have come to the United States on the St. Louis, but years later, America did accept us. That's basically the story of how my family survived the war. But the message here, I think, is that all the countries of the world that were contacted from our ship in Havana Harbor refused us entry. We would have had to have gone back to Germany and surely would not have survived. The St. Louis has become a symbol of how the world turned its back on a small group simply because they were Jewish. That's basically the message of the trip and the voyage of the St. Louis.
Thank you so much, Eva. I know that it was a very moving story, I'm sure, for the students to hear, and I'm sure that they have lots of questions for you this morning. So, Radner, why don't you start us off? Do you have any questions for Mrs. Weiner?
Look at the camera.
How long did you live in England?
We lived in England, you have to do the math, from 1939 to 1946.
Okay, did you do the math? Okay, Egg Harbor Township, we're going to let you do the next question.
Well, it's pretty obvious that she must have been a very little girl at the time.
You're very, very kind.
No, I mean, that's our observation, and you never ask a woman her age, and we don't want to have to do the math, but is it safe to say that you were a little girl at the time?
Yes, I was the second youngest child on the ship.
Okay, well, that's good enough, and
I
so,
was under a year old.
And it's pretty interesting. Any reason why you didn't stay in England?
Yes. Those of my family that were survivors of the war went to either Israel or the United States. We had no family. It was only my parents and I in England, and my parents wanted to be with family. They chose the United States over Israel because at the time it was not yet Israel. It was still Palestine and not yet a free country.
Somebody's got bells ringing. Eva, did your parents try to get out of England during the war, or was that not a possibility?
That was totally impossible. England, of course, was at war at the time as well, and we were bombed out many times. We lived in shelters for much of the time in England. England was at war. We could not leave England at all until after the war.
Thank you. Radner, we're back to you for the next question.
Are you living in the U.S. now?
Yes. I live in a town called Neptune, which is near Asbury Park.
New Jersey.
Yes, in New Jersey. I'm sorry. Yes, I grew up in New York City, in Queens, and when I got married, I moved to the New Jersey shore.
And we should have said she is coming from Brookdale College, which is also in New Jersey. Egg Harbor Township, it's your turn for another question.
Okay, of course, that was our bell that you heard, and we have our announcements coming, so hopefully Justin's question will come through loud and clear.
Okay.
Okay, Justin, let's hear you.
When you got to the United States, were your parents able to run the businesses they ran in England again, or did they find other jobs?
When my parents came to the United States, they already fortunately spoke English, which was of course not the case when we came to England. My parents had family. My mother had family here in the United States, and this is why we came to America as opposed to any other country. My mother's two sisters and brother had already emigrated to the United States. Things were difficult in the beginning because it was difficult for everyone after the war. But my father, having been trained as a baker, because his family actually owned a bakery in Berlin when he was a child, and he worked in the bakery. So when we came to the United States, he was able to earn a living as a baker. My mother had been trained as a dressmaker, so my mother became a personal dressmaker for some of the local women in the neighborhood.
Did your parents learn English in England, or did they speak it when you got to England, Eva?
No, my parents spoke no English when they arrived in England and learned when they got there.
Thank you. Radner, we're back to you.
I'm wondering if you've ever received an official apology from any of either of the countries, or or from any politicians, any of the survivors, about what happened on the St.
That's
Louis?
interesting. That's an interesting question that you ask. Several years ago, Canada, the Canadian group that formed in order to apologize to the St. Louis survivors for not allowing us entry into their country. So they invited us to come to Canada to give a formal apology to those survivors of the St. Louis that could make it. And later on, the United States, actually about 5 years ago, signed a petition apologizing to the St. Louis survivors for not allowing us to come into the United States in 1939. We had a very interesting ceremony in Washington several years ago where the document, the resolution that was signed as an apology, was put into the Library of Congress archives, and some of our survivors of the St. Louis were allowed to come and watch it being placed into the archives. The countries have apologized, but it's difficult to apologize to those who are no longer with us. So I was a little bit skeptical about accepting that apology.
Thank you. Thank you, Radner. That was an interesting question. Egg Harbor Township, we're back to you. The bells are finished.
Yeah, we think so.
All right, how long did you stay on the St. Louis?
The actual voyage took 4 weeks. We came to the United States, actually to Cuba, then traveled to Miami, off the coast of Miami, and then back into Havana, Cuba Harbor, and then went back to Europe. The trip itself was approximately 4 weeks.
Okay, so you're saying total round trip was 4 weeks?
Yes.
And do you remember how long it took to get from Europe to Cuba?
Approximately 12 days.
So that would mean that for about another week you were
in Havana Harbor and Miami.
Okay. Thank you. Radner, do you have another question for Mrs. Weiner?
Yes. Do you still know any survivors from the St. Louis?
Do I know any survivors? Yes, I have met many of the survivors. We have had reunions of St. Louis survivors. One of them in particular is when that resolution was signed in Washington, D.C., we had a reunion there. And when Canada had invited us to come to Canada for a reunion, we also had a reunion in Florida. So I have met many of the survivors in the last 10 years, and we are still in touch with each other.
And did most of them end up in the United States, or are they scattered worldwide?
They are scattered worldwide. Some remained in England. Very few of them, as I say, only 10% of those that went to Europe, that is to France, Holland, or Belgium, which are the 3 European countries, continental European countries that took passengers, only 10% of those survived, and most of them left Europe almost as soon as they could. One, I know, a very dear friend of mine ended up in an orphanage in France. Another gentleman ended up living with a family in France. None of them that went back to Holland or Belgium survived. Those of us that went to England had the best chance of survival. We have seen each other sometime since. Of course, now, because of age, we are losing many of them. You've got to remember, I was one of the youngest children on the ship.
Thank you. Egg Harbor Township, we're back to you.
You said that Canada apologized and the United States apologized. I was wondering if Cuba had given an apology and or if the German government in any one of its incarnations since 1946 had apologized.
Germany has not. Cuba did a very interesting thing. It was not under the Cuban government, but a group that was formulated in Miami of Cuban refugees, I should say, people who have escaped Cuba, formed an apology committee and invited us, and we went back to Cuba. And the Cuban government didn't necessarily apologize, but this group that invited us to Cuba did apologize. And we were able to go to the harbor where the ship was located and docked during that time, and we distributed or threw into the water memorial wreaths for those that did not make it. So the government of Cuba has not really apologized, but some of its citizens have.
Thank you. Radner, we'd like to turn to you for another question.
I was wondering what the conditions were like aboard the ship.
Interesting question. On the trip to Cuba, it was a luxury, beautiful cruise. We had parties and dinners and movies, but once we got to Cuba, things were very, very difficult. And the passengers were in a state of hysteria because they were afraid that they were going to be going back to Germany. And that would have been a terrible tragedy. So the atmosphere on the ship was very, very difficult. As a matter of fact, I learned my first word during that time on the ship, and the word was nein, which means no in German, because the passengers were chanting, no, 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 we will not go back to Germany. And there was close to a riot on the ship when this happened. So the panic then set in because the passengers were afraid that they might have to turn back to Germany. But that's when the passenger committee that was assigned by the captain started investigating other ports and areas that we might be able to go to. But the trip back to Europe was one of panic and fear.
Were there still supplies on the ship when you were going back to Europe, or had all of the supplies, the food, the water, been used up?
They had taken on supplies in Cuba for the trip back, but things were very, very meager. They took only basic necessities. Fortunately, the ship did have enough supplies. Basically, we only had to take fresh things on board in Cuba. They had enough supplies to get us back to Europe.
Thank you. Egg Harbor Township, we'd like to ask you for another question.
Do you know what happened to the captain? Did he return to Germany empty-handed, or what happened?
It's a wonderful question. The captain was very sympathetic to the plight of the passengers. He had never become a member of the Nazi Party, and he did not sympathize with the Nazis and their decisions. The captain was allowed to take one other voyage and then returned back to Germany, and not imprisoned, but his commission was taken away from him, and he died a pauper. He was allowed to live, but only, I think, because he was a symbol to many people. But they really were very angry with him.
Thank you. Let's see. Radner, is it your turn? Or was that just you? Well, Radner, go ahead.
Yes, yeah.
Have you ever returned to your original home in Europe?
Yes, as a matter of fact, several years back, Germany had a program where they invited former residents to come back to apologize for what they did. I was invited to come back to Berlin. My husband and I did go, very reluctantly, I must say, but they invited us with everything supplied. There was a totally paid-for trip, and the idea was to apologize for having thrown us out of Germany and not having given us a safe home. I went back and I was very upset by the fact that there is still an underlying anti-Semitism present in the city of Berlin, which is where I was. I appreciated the fact that they tried to apologize and invited us back and tried to wine and dine us, but I felt that outside of this insulated group that was invited, there was a lot of anti-Semitism still in existence in Germany today.
Eva, some of the other survivors who I've spoken to who talk about going back so that the Germans could apologize said that they were also asked to speak to students in Germany to tell about what happened to them. Did you have that experience?
So my group was not invited to do that.
Okay.
They've been doing that for many years, so they might have done it with other groups, but my group in particular was not invited to do that.
So the anti-Semitism that you still felt was among people in the hotel, in the city that you were in? Where did you feel confronted by this?
Outside of the city. I did not feel it so much in the city, but when we traveled outside the city on our own, in other words, we were a group of 90 people that were chauffeured everywhere by bus and by with guides with us. But when my husband and I went out on our own, we went into the rural areas, and the taxi cab driver, for example, was very nasty when he heard why we were there. And this was the kind of atmosphere that we felt when we were outside of our insulated group.
Interesting. Thank you. Egg Harbor Township, it's your turn.
Yeah, you said that you didn't think of yourself as a Holocaust survivor. You know, obviously you are a survivor, but have you met other Holocaust survivors who have gone through different things, like they've been in camps, or many of them have gone on, but other children who may have been hidden? And if so, how do you get along in, let's say, the hierarchy of Holocaust survivors? Do older Holocaust survivors who had been in camps, do they accept you as a Holocaust survivor? I don't know if you've ever actually been in that situation.
I never considered myself a Holocaust survivor until somebody told me that I was. I did not experience the traumas of concentration camps and hidden children and many of the other traumatic experiences. So for many years, I did not consider myself a survivor until somebody told me that in my own small way, I can classify myself as such. I thank God that I did not have to endure the hardships of so many of my friends who unfortunately were in Europe, in the continental European countries, and survived concentration camps and what have you. My life was much, much easier than any of those. Although living in England as a Jew was not easy either. We were discriminated against, and we did have problems. But of course, I cannot possibly compare them to what it would have been like if I had been in continental Europe. I did not even consider myself a survivor until the book that spoke about the ship, the St. Louis, until that ship was made famous by Voyage of the Damned, which was a book and a movie, I never considered myself a survivor. So by some definitions, I guess I'm not. And yet, because I did experience some anti-Semitism in Europe, they classified me as a survivor. Does that answer your question?
Egg Harbor Township, are you still there?
Sorry, I had a student, you ever see the pariv, the U in the circle?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, some of my students think that they are the U in the circle. And we have our research papers due today, so there was someone that kind of didn't understand the importance of video conferencing. So the United States is a wonderful place, and we're glad you're here, and you're glad you're here. What is your reaction to, and I don't know if you really want to comment on this, you may or may not, current American immigration policy in terms of, people in a similar situation and perhaps the United States maybe granting special permission for them to come, but more than likely they don't, and so I don't know, would you like to comment on the current immigration policy?
Very, very personally, I try to be apolitical. However, when I years ago saw the Haitian boat people and situations such as that could be compared to the St. Louis, I am hurt by the fact that there are people in the United States that are not willing to stretch out a hand to the needy, if in fact they are, because we have a vast country that can accommodate it. When people are persecuted, it is our duty to reach out a hand. I am grateful that the United States accepted me after the war, but I think my life would have been much, much more different, much different, had I been accepted in 1939. But the atmosphere in the United States in 1939 was totally different than it is today, or even in 1946, when I came.
Did they ever give a reason for not accepting the St. Louis in the United States? Or did they just say, oh no, sorry, our doors are closed?
They gave several reasons. None of them I think are valid, but That's not for me to dispute. There was a book written by a Canadian, I think, that sums it up. Canada said one is too many in referring to admitting Jews into Canada. And it's the title of a book written about the government of Canada during this period. The reason they did not accept Jews at the time was because there had been so much adverse propaganda against accepting Jews. That's why Canada also refused us, as did the United States. They closed their immigration numbers, and obviously they changed those later on, but to decide who should come to the United States and who shouldn't should not have been as arbitrary.
Thank you. Radner, we're back to you for the next question.
When you were originally turned down by the United States, what were your feelings about the U.S. in general, and have those changed today?
I couldn't hear the question.
Okay, let me repeat it to you.
When you were originally turned down by the United States, what were your feelings about the U.S. in general, and have those feelings changed today?
I heard the first part, I didn't hear the second part.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat it. He's asking, what were your feelings when the United States first turned you away about the United States, and have your feelings towards the United States changed today?
We were resentful, obviously. Here is this beautiful, vast country that could certainly accept 900 people, and simply because we were Jews, said no and sent us back to Europe. We were extremely upset, but most other countries said the same. Only 4 countries agreed. There had been a passenger committee formed on the ship that started contacting every country in the world, asking for permission for us to land, and only the 4 that accepted us agreed. There were many countries that said no, but the United States at that time certainly could have absorbed 900 people. It was very, very hurtful. And the only reason, and my parents didn't want to originally come to the United States, and the only reason we did is because my mother's family was here. But we resented America for a long time because they refused us entry.
And how do you feel about the United States today? Do you still feel that resentment, or do you feel that your feelings towards the United States have changed because of the years that you've spent here?
Obviously, my perception of what the United States is and should be has changed because I chose, as a 25-year-old, to become an American citizen. So I was no longer a child with resentment to the United States, and realized that the government that existed in 1939 was not the same government that existed when I came to the United States in 1946. And I couldn't be angry with people who were no longer in office. I was angry with who was there at the time for refusing us,